The United States will host the 1994 World Cup soccer tournament.
That's right. With that nonchalant announcement, Americans learned that they were going to host the 1994 World Cup. The announcement was timed to coincide with America's Independence Day, July 4th, 1988. But then again, it wasn't exactly front-page news. And some newspapers, such as this one in North Carolina, had a hard time getting the year right in the headline. Well, all those mistakes aside, the fact that the United States was awarded the World Cup should surprise you. After all, in 1988, there was no top-level football league in the United States. There was literally nothing. Now, to be fair, there was a time in the 1970s when soccer was somewhat popular in the United States, the time of the NASL. And to be fair to the NASL, the popularity carried over into the 1980 season. Eventually, though, the empty seats and the high player salaries took its toll on the league. 1984 was the NASL's last season, and it faded away quickly afterwards. Now, for a little while, indoor soccer was popular in the United States. In fact, you could say that the popularity of indoor soccer was one of the major factors in the decline and the ultimate demise of the NASL. Indoor soccer was like watching hockey on artificial turf. It was really only nominally related to association football. And with final scores like this, it might as well have been the NHL of the 1980s. When the NASL folded, it technically was the outdoor part of the league that folded. The indoor part tried to stay active for a while and wound up merging with the major indoor soccer league, which is where some of those teams survived. And so technically there was soccer in the United States in the late 1980s, but as you can see, it was a completely different sport. In fact, the final game of the 1988 Major Indoor Soccer League Finals was played less than a month before the World Cup announcement came. But with power plays, more liberal substitution rules, and a smaller field, this was really hockey with a soccer ball, not proper football. And so all of this makes the paradox even more of a paradox. I mean, why in the world would FIFA award the United States the World Cup when the United States didn't have a top-flight league? And why in the world would anybody think that there was still demand in the United States for soccer, a sport that the country had largely rejected? Well, let's dig in and see what we can find. Our story actually goes all the way back to June 10, 1974, when Colombia was recommended to host the 1986 World Cup. Now, there was a note at that time that both the United States and Australia were considering bidding on a World Cup finals, but this was pretty vague. The other interesting thing is that there doesn't seem to have been any actual competition for the rights to host that World Cup. Now, far be it from me to accuse FIFA of corruption, but rumor has it that the president of FIFA at that time had a close friendship with the head of sports in Colombia. That might help explain the surprise announcement. Now, to an extent, there were actually preparations underway to get Colombia ready for the 1986 World Cup. If you look around, it's not hard to find pieces of evidence of this World Cup that never actually happened. But of course, in the end, it just didn't happen. The most famous piece of evidence has got to be this announcement on the back of the Colombian edition of the 1982 World Cup sticker album. It says, "We support the World Cup Colombia 86. Italy and West Germany were set to face off in the 1982 World Cup final. That same day, articles began to appear about Colombia's reluctance to spend public money on preparing venues for the 1986 World Cup. And at the same time, the United States had put together a package to potentially host the 1990 World Cup and was talking about taking over the 1986 World Cup if Colombia backed out. Now, the part that you won't see in those newspaper articles is how reluctant FIFA was to allow the United States to host the Cup. You see, the NASL brand of the sport was simply different. There were a lot of worries that the American modifications to soccer might turn the World Cup into a farce. There were American innovations such as the 35-yard line, which was supposed to liberalize the offside rule. There was the shootout, which used a bizarre format in the United States. And then there was the little fact that practically every single American stadium used artificial turf. And this artificial turf issue is really something we need to discuss. This tends to be obfuscated when we talk about the issues with the sport in the United States. The truth is that artificial turf completely changed the game and it made it almost unwatchable. It was also horrible for the players. Watch any NASL game for a few minutes and you'll see what I'm talking about. Defenders simply wouldn't go to the ground on that surface. Now, the game looked a little bit better when it was played on natural grass and dirt. But, of course, the game looked strange when played in stadiums that were actually designed for baseball. And so, if you look closely at the optimistic articles about the United States hosting the 1986 World Cup, make sure that you read the fine print. Those plans relied in large part on the United States using an untried and unproven method to stick natural grass on top of the artificial turf. You see, in the United States at that time, most of these large stadiums were designed to host multiple different sports. They were funded using public funds and they belonged to municipalities. Artificial turf was simply the cheapest option out there, no matter how bad it was on the legs and the knees of the players. And honestly, I believe that this was a major sticking point for FIFA. Anyway, by late October 1982, Colombia was simply out of the running for the 1986 World Cup. Though Canada had a hopeful claim, the United States was really the only country that already had stadiums that were large enough and that had never hosted the Cup before. And of course, there was still a top-flight league in the United States at that time. American sports writers were bursting with optimism in late 1982, though I really don't think Memphis, Tennessee could realistically host World Cup matches. By December, though, articles began to emerge about Brazil being the likely host of the Cup. At that same time, there were ominous signs of the pending collapse of the NASL, such as this clipping about the Montreal Monic losing money left and right, and this one about the famous beer battle over which city would host Team Canada. That Team Canada beer fight is great material for another video. Anyway, it's really hard to tell what happened since all the negotiations basically happened in secret. However, by early 1983, it's clear that Mexico was going to host the World Cup again, even though the country had just hosted it in 1970. This article came out in the Baltimore Sun in January 1983 and pretty much spelled the end of the United States candidacy. And of course, it was flanked by this article about the awful Team America experiment in the 1983 NASL, which was an infamous failure. For what it was worth, Pelé came out in support of America's World Cup bid. So did then-President Ronald Reagan, although the key of this article is the insinuation at the beginning that the NASL might not survive if the United States did not get the World Cup. And in the end, of course, the Cup went to Mexico. There was apparently some concern about the so-called Americanization of the sport. Though frankly, I think the rumored South American boycott if the continent lost the Cup was probably a little bit more convincing. Anyway, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger tried to use his diplomatic powers of persuasion, but alas, to no avail. And most telling of all, FIFA was unconvinced that the United States hosting the World Cup would suddenly make the sport economically viable in the country. The last point is the sort of point that gets looked over all the time. Remember, FIFA said this in May 1983. The NASL was dead about 15 months later. In hindsight, I think they were right. And in fact, the NASL's decision to pivot towards the indoor sport was actually an attempt to drum up more American interest in the sport. The magic makers at FIFA had determined that it was Europe's turn in 1990, and so the United States did not bother submitting a bid. England threw out a bid for 1990, but that didn't go very far. Anyway, in October 1987, the United States formally submitted its bid to host the 1994 World Cup. And here there seemed to be an answer to that artificial turf conundrum. It's fair to ask what had changed this time around to make the United States bid a bit more viable. The answer actually was the 1984 Olympic Games in Los Angeles. Now, the Summer Olympics in 1984 were really a big deal in the United States, even though most Americans have forgotten about it. Not only was association football played, but the matches were actually really well attended. The crowds were absolutely huge and the fans were extremely enthusiastic. In fact, legend has it that it was this tournament that saw the birth of the so-called Mexican Wave. Over 97,000 fans attended this particular match in the Rose Bowl. The matches took place on both the East and West Coasts, demonstrating that logistics could work despite the immense size of the United States. In a very real sense, this was an audition for a potential World Cup, and the United States passed with flying colors. Of course, there was still that thorny matter of the NASL disappearing, something that really was an issue once the United States got the World Cup rights. Now, there was some semi-professional outdoor soccer in the late 80s and early 90s in the United States. However, this was far from top-level professional quality, as you can clearly see. These teams played in small stadiums in front of sparse crowds. There were occasionally requests to treat one of these leagues as a top-level professional league, but they fell on deaf ears. With less than 6 months before the opening of the 1994 World Cup, the pending formation of Major League Soccer was announced. Now, I'll let you decide whether the early predictions of pending Major League Soccer success have actually been fulfilled or not. Well, and that's how it happened. It was a story of graft, as usual, combined with a lot of internal politics. Now, most people don't like talking about this story. After all, it highlights the fact that these tournaments cost a ton of money for countries to host, especially countries with other economic problems. Though we can blame politics on the lack of a 1986 United States World Cup, I honestly think that the blame should go to the artificial turf. 1994 really should be seen as a sort of a consolation prize to the United States, kind of an international face-saving measure. And to be quite blunt, the NASL was doomed to fail regardless of which country hosted the 1986 World Cup. Now, do you think that the 1994 World Cup actually made the sport viable in the United States? I'll tell you what, I was 10 years old at the time and I thought that soccer really was the sport of the future. These days, I'm not so sure that it really made that much of a difference, but what do you think?